I don't want my dirty linen laundered in public. I'm going to show you a side of David, the king of Israel, that isn't very flattering. And I'm not sure that he would even want me to tell it to you. If you study any of the portraits of biblical heavyweights, you're going to find that they all had faults. But more books, more movies, more sermons, more analysis has been done on what I'm going to tell you than any other event, I think, in the Bible. I can think of only one other sin in the Bible that surpasses this one, and that would be Adam and Eve's. I'm talking about David and Bathsheba. When you hear what I'm going to say, you're going to think, how could a man after God's own heart do such a thing? But don't be too critical of him. Don't be too hard on him. It's the most explosive activity repeated in our world today. Kings do it. Prime ministers, clergymen, presidents, priests, teachers, business executives, celebrities, students, married couples, soldiers, even seminary students. They do this. And sadly, the aftermath can be very devastating. 1 Corinthians 10:12, it tells us a warning. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. You'll notice caught between the word stand and the word fall is the phrase take heed. That's the point in my lesson today. Take heed. David the king, he's been on the throne now for 20 years. He's 50 years old. And he has a solid resume. Man of God, handsome, composer of music, poet, wrote dozens of psalms. He was a warrior in battle, decorated soldier, leader of his people, and he was the king of Israel. His empire spread like wildfire when he was on the throne, and it gobbled up territory for hundreds of miles. He was the king of Judah. He was the king of Israel. He was the Philistine king, Moabites, Hittites, Edomites, Amorites, and every other ite, I think, in the scripture. Now comes the setting for this drama. Now, I'm talking about color, I'm talking about action, I'm talking about plotting, I'm talking about mystery, and I'm also talking about assassination. 3 characters are going to make up our story. One is David. The other is a woman called Bathsheba. And the third is Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite. Now, I'm going to treat it like a Shakespearean play. It's going to be made up of four acts. Here's the first act. 2 Samuel 5:12. David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and Judah, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people. It was springtime, a time when kings went forth to war. Now, we do that sort of thing here in Alberta. It was the time when men went forth to do their hunting. I'm talking about the fall, this time of year. And you can go to the government and you can get tags for animals like a moose, an elk, a deer. And when you buy the tag, you have the privilege during that hunting season to go and shoot them as a game. Well, that's what David did. It was a time when kings went forth to war. They did it every year. On this spring, the sun rather had warmed the earth, and life has sprung forth, and you can see it everywhere. David didn't leave the palace that spring. Instead, he sent his troops with Joab, his general, to fight the Ammonites and besiege Rabbah, their capital. When kings go forth to war, David didn't do that year. David stayed home. He was back in Jerusalem. Now that should be your first clue. The leader of the most highly trained soldiers on earth, he didn't go with his warriors this time. He probably thought, I'm 50 years old. I deserve a break today. Our society tells us that all the time. When you get that old, relax a bit. You've earned it. Put your feet up. It was early evening. There's magic in springtime. Birds are singing. David's on the rooftop of his palace, going for a walk. He looks out over the fields and he sees the green growth. And he sees that brand new touch of life. But looking down from the walls, he sees her, a woman, bathing on the roof of her house. And she's extremely attractive. Her name is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, David knows better. He's married. But there below him, on the roof, comes a vision of loveliness. A loveliness that he can't take his eyes off. A desire begins to stir deep inside him. Our greatest battles don't come when we're working hard. Our battles don't even come when we're out on the battlefield fighting our enemy. That spring, David deserved a break. Take some time off. Just a little leisure. He finally has some time on his hands. Just for him. He belonged in the battle. Instead, he was home. Up on the palace roof with some popcorn and a taste of pomegranate. Now comes 2 Samuel 11, verse 2. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful in appearance. This woman, very attractive. I also think that she was a bit careless. She lacked Hebrew modesty. Washing in a place where she could be overlooked. She knows better than that. All I'm saying, if David had gone to war, he would not have seen Bathsheba that night. And if Bathsheba was using her head, she would not have put temptation in David's path. Do you know what the opposite of sensuality is? It's called righteousness. What does that mean? It means that you pay attention to your actions. It means that you pay attention to your dress. It means that you pay attention to your looks. And you also pay attention to your conduct. David faced something, even though he was full of godliness, that he couldn't handle. So I want you to be careful, David. I want you to be controlled, David. And I want you to be modest, David. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book Temptation, he said this: Satan doesn't fill us with hatred of God. He just wants us to forget God for just a little bit of a time. He went on to say, lust that envelops the mind will lead you into the deepest darkness, and the powers of decision-making are taken from you. That night, on the roof of David's palace, with nobody looking, David lost his head, and he fell into sin. Act 1. Now comes Act 2. Bathsheba is the wife of one of David's own military. He's a loyal soldier in David's army, in his regiment. Do you know where he is? He's away with Joab, fighting the war that David should be fighting. He should be there with them. There on the battlefield, Uriah is dreaming of his beautiful wife, looking forward to his next leave, when he can come home and be with her. He doesn't know that David, the king, sent for her, took her, sleeps with her, and then she goes home. Just a quick affair. Then it's all over. But it isn't over. 2 Samuel 11, verse 5, Bathsheba discovers that she's pregnant by David and sends him a message to inform him. And what do you think David's going to do? Well, as quickly as he can, he sends his version of a telegram out to the battlefield to Joab, his commander. And he says to Joab, "Send me the soldier Uriah the Hittite to me right away." David's up to something. Uriah's wife is pregnant. But Uriah, he's been gone for a long time. David pretends the baby isn't his. Get that husband home as quickly as he can, he thinks. Nobody will ever know whose baby it really is. How smart would you say the devil is? Satan, the enemy of your soul. Put yourself in David's shoes. You just did what he did. When you're having great pleasure, the devil will never stand in your way. He won't tell you the price of your temptation. All you see is the fun, the beauty, the ecstasy, and the excitement. Satan won't tell you ahead of time that this is going to ruin your family. He won't tell you that. You don't think about pregnancy. When sin is done, all the penalties of that mistake, they come due. When that happens, Satan is nowhere to be found. You are completely then on your own. 2 Samuel 11:7 says, when Uriah got back to Jerusalem, David asked him for news from the front. How are things going with Joab, our leader and the troops? How's it going with the fighting? And then he said to Uriah, "You're a good soldier. I brought you home so that you could go home and have a refreshing bath, have a good night's rest, and enjoy your wife." I have so much respect for this guy Uriah. Back from the battle, all his comrades in uniform, they're fighting back there for their lives. They're all in harm's way. Here he is, back home with his wife. They aren't home with their wives. Knowing that, Uriah doesn't go home. 2 Samuel 11:8 says, after Uriah left the palace, he didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance along with the king's servants in the barracks. End of Act 2. Now comes Act 3. Uriah was a far better man than David was a king. David, you should be ashamed of yourself. You call yourself the commander-in-chief, a man after God's own heart, a man of integrity? No, you're not. The man that you brought home from the front, he's the hero in our story. He's only a foot soldier, a nobody. He isn't decorated. But from the top of his head to the sole of his shoes, he's committed to his nation. And he's committed to the God of his nation, Yahweh. And David, the man after God's own heart, you're too dumb to even see it. Listen to the words of 2 Samuel 11:11. David had just asked the next morning when Uriah came in, "Did you go home last night?" Uriah replied to David, "The Ark of the Covenant is out there in the fighting field in harm's way with the men of Israel and Judah. The men on the battlefield are in trenches and they're in tents. Joab, our commander, and his servants are roughing it out in the fields. So how can I go home and eat and drink and enjoy my wife? I'm not going to do it." That last line says all you need to know. David's deceptive tricks didn't work. Now he's panic-stricken. All his plans have failed. David, he could steal this soldier's wife, but he can't steal this soldier's heart. If you're a general in the army, wouldn't you love to go over the top from your trench with a soldier like this, Uriah? That man would die for you. As I read between the lines, that man would go down the barrel of a cannon for you. Bathsheba's husband won't cooperate. David's anxiety now accelerates. Something has to be done. David tells Uriah, well, stay here tonight, and tomorrow I'm going to let you go back to the army. You can go back to the front. Do you think David thought Uriah would break down and that night go home and sleep with his wife? He didn't. He stayed again at the palace barracks with the men. He didn't go home. Well, by now, David is beside himself. Now comes the checkmate in our story. David, he writes a letter. He knows that he's beaten. In the morning, he hands the letter to Uriah and says to him, "It's time to go back to the battle again. Take this message. Take it to my commander Joab. I have sealed it with my seal, and I'm putting it in your hands, and I don't want anybody, nobody else is going to handle this but my general, and deliver it to him only." Do you know what the letter said? Verse 14, 2 Samuel 11. Put Uriah in the front lines where the fighting is the fiercest. Then pull back. Leave him exposed so that he's sure to be killed. That's how Uriah died. Joab got the letter. The city was besieged. Uriah didn't stand a chance. The enemy got the best of him. Uriah was killed. What a sordid story. David, back in Jerusalem, he sends for Bathsheba, the widow of the man that he's just murdered. He makes her his wife. Mission accomplished. David preened like a peacock. Inside, he probably said, wow, that was close. David got away with it. End of Act 3. Now comes the final act, Act 4. 1 whole year passes. Bathsheba has her baby, but the baby dies. This Act 4 is probably the most dramatic of all. What a conclusion to our play. One morning, David on his throne, wrapped in his royal robes, his attendant comes in and he says, Your Majesty, Nathan the prophet's here to see you. Having gotten away with that affair, David has a high opinion of himself. He looks at Nathan and he says, I wonder what he wants. Nathan gets right to the point. He says to David, Your Majesty, I'm facing a difficulty, and I need your advice. You're my king. David replies, Well, tell me your problem, and I'll see what I can do. Here's what Nathan says to him. I'm dealing with a wealthy individual in our kingdom who has flocks and he has herds, more than he can count. A poor man just down the road has only one little lamb, and he keeps it in his house, sort of like a family pet. His kids love it. That wealthy man has out-of-town visitors come to visit him, and they enjoy a beautiful banquet that he puts on, and they serve lamb chops to all the visitors. But instead of butchering a lamb from his own flock, he goes next door and he butchers the poor man's little household pet, and he serves it to his guests. How can I solve that, Your Honor? It's been heavy on my mind. Nathan the prophet says to David. Well, David hears this, and his anger turns to fury. To think that would go on in my kingdom, under my nose, that's unthinkable. That idiot doesn't deserve to live. Well, he's going to pay back 4 times everything that he's taken. I won't tolerate that behavior in Israel. Who is he? There's a long pause. Then Nathan says, Thou art the man, David. Out of his own mouth, David convicted himself. He grapples for words. Now come some of the greatest words ever uttered. And there's only 6 of them. I have sinned against the Lord. Some of the greatest rulers on earth have covered up their wrongdoings, and then they're found out. Do you have something in your life and you're hiding it? This is how I want you to handle it. I want you to handle it just like David did. When you say, I have sinned, that's when God moves in. That's the most valuable experience that you're ever going to have on this earth. No one ever came to Christ who didn't say those very words, I have sinned. God knows your full potential, and you're never going to make it until you utter those words, I have sinned. And when you do, then it's when you begin to start growing as a person. Perhaps David's greatest psalm, and he wrote many of them. This was the best one he ever wrote, Psalm 51. And they came shortly after Nathan left the palace that morning. After he had been confronted with this story about the little lamb, it was then that he sat down and wrote these amazing words. Here's what he said. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, and a broken and a contrite heart. God, I know you won't despise. I want you to take those words, and I want you to make them yours. And you know, if you do, you're going to become a man after God's own heart. See you next week. Thanks for coming today.